Winter came down hard on a small town in Montana where snow covered secrets as easily as rooftops. A woman disappeared behind prison walls for a crime she did not commit. Years passed in silence until one Christmas, a German shepherd was brought through iron gates. What happened next was not written in law books, but in instinct, loyalty, and love. This is a story about truth that waited patience that endured and a bond that refused to forget. As you listen, ask yourself, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment and share your place with us. If stories of hope, justice, and loyal dogs touch your heart, please press subscribe to support the channel and walk with us through more stories like this. Whitehaven, Montana, in December, did not announce itself with cheer. It arrived like a slow exhale from the mountains, cold and deliberate, frosting the town into stillness. Snow quilted the roofs in thick, patient layers, pressed sound flat against the earth, and turned each street lamp into a small, lonely moon floating above the streets. The wind carried the smell of pine sap and iron, and the sky hung low and pale, as if the world itself were holding its breath. At the northern edge of town stood Ridgecrest State Prison, a slab of concrete and wire pressed into the hillside like a scar that never healed. Inside those walls, winter sharpened. The corridors smelled of bleach, old metal, and something harder to name, stale fear mixed with prayers that had been whispered too often to still feel holy. Claire Morgan was 31 years old and already looked older in the way people do when time has been taught to weigh them down instead of carry them forward. She was of average height, slim but not fragile. Her frame, once athletic from years of walking city blocks and climbing courthouse stairs, now tightened by routine and restraint. Her skin was fair, marked faintly by freckles across the bridge of her nose, and her dark brown hair, once worn in a practical knot, had been cut short by prison rules, leaving her face exposed in a way that felt almost indecent. Her eyes were gray-blue, sharp and watchful, the kind of eyes that noticed patterns before others realized there was anything to see at all. People used to describe her as calm, reliable, quietly relentless, the sort of woman who listened more than she spoke and spoke only when she was sure. That steadiness had not been born gentle. It had been forged years earlier, when her father died suddenly during her graduate studies, leaving her to balance grief with responsibility. She learned then that emotion could be survived by discipline, that order was a form of mercy. Those lessons carried her into her career as a financial crimes investigator, attached to a multi-agency task force, where she developed a reputation for seeing wolves beneath wool, for following numbers the way hunters follow tracks. But now, she sat on the narrow bunk in cell C-14, hands folded loosely in her lap, listening to the prison settle and creak the way ships do in bad seas. She was not on death row. This was not a story that needed the spectacle of needles to be terrifying. She was serving life without parole, the legal version of forever. A sentence that did not rush to kill the body, but patiently taught it to forget the taste of sunlight. The case that put her here had unfolded during a winter much like this one, when a regional relief charity collapsed under the weight of its own lies. The charity had been the quiet spine of Whitehaven's winter survival, keeping heaters running for the elderly, paying for insulin when roads closed and snow made the town an island. Money vanished. Ledgers were altered. As I say, volunteer, a woman in her 60s with arthritic hands and a habit of baking too many pies, died during a blizzard after her heat shut off. The town, aching for order and absolution, needed a villain, and villains, like Christmas trees, were easiest to decorate when they were already standing in the living room. Grant Hollis, the charity's senior administrator, was a man in his mid-50s with a salesman's smile polished smooth by practice, silver hair combed carefully back, suits that fit just well enough to suggest authority without intimacy. He was known for his charm, for his ability to make donors feel seen, and for his habit of delegating anything that carried real risk. When the investigation began, his finger pointed neatly at Claire. Emails appeared with her name on them. Digital signatures matched her credentials. Transactions traced back to her login. The case was so perfectly assembled it felt staged, but staged things often read best to the public. Claire protested calmly at first, then with rising urgency, pointing out inconsistencies, time stamps that contradicted custody logs, security gaps that made no sense. Her warnings were dismissed as self-serving. By the time the verdict came down, the town had already moved on, convinced it had buried its monster under concrete and paperwork. Now, years later, December pressed its cold hands against the prison walls as Warden Thomas Hale walked the tier with a clipboard tucked against his chest. Hale was in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair thinning and cut close to his scalp, his face lined by habit rather than age. He was a man built out of rules, his posture straight, his movements economical, his voice rarely rising above a controlled baritone. People said he was fair, which in prison meant predictable. He stopped at Claire's cell and looked in at her with eyes that had learned not to linger. "Morgan," he said, voice echoing softly against concrete. "Holiday policy allows for humanitarian requests, within reason." Claire looked up at him, surprised by how calm her voice sounded when she answered. "I want to see my dog." Hale blinked once, the clipboard lowering slightly. "A pet?" "A German shepherd," she said. "His name is Axel." The name hung between them, oddly heavy. For a moment, the fluorescent lights hummed like insects circling a secret. Hale did not promise anything. He did not soften. Yet, when he turned to leave, something in his posture faltered, a barely perceptible hesitation, like a man hearing an old song through a wall he believed he had sealed. As his footsteps faded, Claire exhaled slowly and whispered into the cold, "Please." She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency the prison did not accept. But memory came anyway, uninvited, carrying the shape of Axel as he had been before the night everything broke. Axel had been 5 years old when she last saw him, a German shepherd with a sable coat that shifted from black along his back to warm tan at his flanks, broad-chested and powerful without heaviness. His ears stood tall and alert, his muzzle already flecked with the faintest dusting of gray that came from seriousness rather than age. His eyes were amber, the color of firelight caught in resin, and they missed very little. He was not a frantic dog, nor a foolishly obedient one. He thought before he moved, watched before he trusted. Claire used to joke that he had inherited her job instincts without the paycheck. She had adopted him as a gangly puppy with paws too large for his body, and raised him with patience and structure, long walks in winter air, evenings spent with spreadsheets open on her laptop, while Axel lay at her feet like a sentry. He had been there when work ran late, when cases followed her home, when the world outside seemed held together by lies and numbers. He was not trained as a service animal, but he learned her rhythms, her silences, the way her shoulders tightened when something felt wrong. The night of her arrest, the snow had fallen like torn feathers, and Axel had placed himself between her and the shouting strangers, body squared, teeth bared not in rage but in warning. He did not bite. He did not need to. When the door closed behind the officers and she was led away, his bark followed her down the stairs, raw and confused, a sound that cut deeper than any accusation. Back in her cell, Claire lay down on the bunk and stared at the ceiling, tracing hairline cracks as if they were maps to somewhere warmer. The prison groaned around her, settling for the night. Somewhere beyond the walls, Whitehaven prepared for Christmas, lights blinking against snow, families gathering around tables. Somewhere, perhaps, Axel was still alive, still waiting. The thought was both comfort and ache, a double-edged mercy. She did not know if the warden would grant her request. She did not know if the world had any tenderness left to spare for a woman it had already condemned. But she knew this. Love, once given, did not understand sentences or walls. It waited, it watched, and sometimes it remembered louder than the law. The night Claire Morgan was arrested, Whitehaven disappeared beneath snow, so thick it seemed the sky had been torn open and emptied without mercy. The wind drove the flakes sideways, scraping them against brick and glass, filling the air with a sound like dry bones whispering together. Inside Claire's small apartment on the edge of town, the heater hummed unevenly, fighting a losing battle against the cold that pressed at the windows. The living room was modest but orderly. A second-hand couch with a wool blanket folded precisely over one arm, a narrow bookshelf lined with case files and old paperbacks. And near the window, a small artificial Christmas tree she had not yet decorated, its green branches bent slightly, waiting. Axel sensed the change before the door broke open. He was 5 years old then, fully grown, his German shepherd frame powerful and balanced, built for endurance rather than speed. His sable coat darkened along his spine and lightened toward his legs, thick enough to hold off the worst of winter, but sleek from careful grooming. His ears lifted sharply as footsteps thundered up the stairs, his body stiffening, muscles coiling beneath his fur. Axel was not a reckless dog. He did not bark at shadows or charge at strangers without reason. Claire had raised him with structure and trust, teaching him boundaries, reading his intelligence with respect. That intelligence now told him something was wrong. When the door burst open and men flooded the apartment, voices loud and overlapping, flashlights slicing the darkness into jagged shapes, Axel moved without hesitation. He placed himself directly in front of Claire, broad chest squared, legs planted wide, tail stiff but low. His teeth showed, not in frenzy but in warning, his amber eyes locked on the nearest officer with a clarity that said he understood exactly what was at stake. He did not bite, he did not lunge. His stillness was the threat. Claire, hands already raised, felt her heart slam painfully against her ribs. "Axel," she said softly, her voice steady by habit even as fear surged. "It's okay." It was not okay, but she needed him to hear calm. The officers slowed. One of them, a man in his 30s with tired eyes and a jaw shadowed by stubble, swallowed and glanced at his partner. They had expected panic, maybe shouting, not this quiet wall of fur and discipline. A handler was called in, a woman with careful movements and a voice trained for storms. She approached Axel the way one approached something sacred and dangerous, speaking low, respectful. When she slipped the catch-pole into place and eased a muzzle over his snout, Axel allowed it, confusion flickering through his eyes. He never took them off Claire. When the sedative took hold and his legs finally folded beneath him, Claire cried out, the sound tearing loose from her chest, despite years of practiced control. It was the last thing Axel heard clearly before the world went dark. When he woke, the apartment smelled wrong. Too many people, too much fear. Claire was gone. Axel rose unsteadily, muzzle removed, leash tight in unfamiliar hands. He searched every room, nose pressed to floors and furniture, whining softly, the sound raw and confused. The men spoke around him, their voices meaningless noise. He pulled toward the door until the leash cut into his chest. Then he sat, ears forward, waiting. Hours passed. The snow outside kept falling. Claire did not return. Axel was transferred the next morning, then the next. His life reduced to paperwork and labels. At the county shelter, a squat concrete building that smelled of disinfectant and wet fur, his intake form described him in tidy terms. Male, German Shepherd, approximately 5 years old, high drive, intelligent, strong attachment to previous owner. Attachment issues, they added later, when he refused food the first night and paced his kennel until his paws bled faintly against the concrete. Maris O'Neill worked the shelter desk during those weeks. She was in her early 40s, freckled with curly red hair usually pulled into a messy bun, her body compact and sturdy from years of lifting crates and dogs who did not want to be lifted. Her kindness was not soft, it was tired and persistent, shaped by too many goodbyes. She noticed Axel immediately. He did not bark like the others. He watched. When she knelt outside his kennel, he approached slowly, head low, eyes searching her face, as if trying to find someone else inside it. "You're not broken," she murmured to him one evening, fingers slipping through the bars to scratch gently behind his ears. "You're just waiting." 2 months passed. Axel's file grew thicker with notes about his strength, his refusal to bond easily, his habit of sitting at the kennel door at dusk, staring toward the road. Then, one cold afternoon, Officer Daniel Reed walked in. Daniel was 44 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his body carrying the quiet wear of long hours on rural patrol. His hair was dark but thinning at the temples, his face lined not by anger but by restraint. He dressed plainly, jeans, boots scuffed from work, a heavy jacket that smelled faintly of coffee and engine oil. A widower of 3 years, he moved through the world carefully now, as if afraid sudden motions might crack something fragile inside him. He had not planned to adopt a dog. He told himself he was only there to look, a harmless lie he offered the empty ranch house he returned to each night. Maris brought Axel out on a leash, warning Daniel softly. "He's strong, smart, he's loyal." Axel did not pull. He did not wag wildly. He stood still, head slightly tilted, studying Daniel the way one studies weather, searching for signs of danger or promise. Daniel knelt despite the protest in his knees, the joints cracking like old wood. He met Axel's gaze without forcing it, his voice low and steady. "You've been left behind," he said, more to himself than to the dog. "I know that song." Axel stepped forward and placed one heavy paw on Daniel's knee, the contact deliberate, grounding. A sound rose from his chest, low and aching, half whine, half prayer. Maris felt her throat tighten. Daniel exhaled slowly, something inside him giving way. He signed the papers that day. Daniel's ranch sat on the outskirts of Whitehaven, a modest spread with a sagging barn and a porch wrapped in mismatched Christmas lights that blinked stubbornly against the snow. A plastic reindeer leaned crookedly in the yard, one leg slightly bent, its painted eyes permanently startled. Daniel laughed when Axel sniffed it cautiously and said, "Even the deers had a rough year." Humor helped Daniel breathe, but it did not heal the emptiness that filled his evenings. Axel settled into the house with quiet efficiency. He learned the boundaries quickly, slept on the rug beside Daniel's bed, followed him through chores with watchful calm. But every evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills and the snow reflected the fading light, Axel walked to the fence line and stared toward town. He did not bark. He did not pace. He simply watched, ears pricked, body angled toward something Daniel could not see. Daniel noticed. At first he told himself it was instinct, a shepherd watching his territory. But the way Axel's body held itself, tense, expectant, spoke of something deeper. "She's still out there, isn't she?" Daniel murmured one night, leaning on the fence beside him. Axel did not move. He did not need to answer. Daniel learned the truth the way one learns winter, slowly, through repetition. This dog was not waiting for a new life. He was waiting for his person. And somewhere beyond the snow and wire and concrete, a woman named Claire Morgan sat in a cell and whispered a name into the cold, unaware that love had not forgotten the way back to her. Warden Thomas Hale had learned, over decades of service, how to make himself smaller inside his own body. Not physically, he was still a tall man, broad in the shoulders, his spine straight from habit. But inwardly, where memory lived and regret sharpened its knives, prison work demanded that skill. It asked men to become containers rather than participants, witnesses rather than judges, statues rather than souls. Hale was 58 years old, his hair iron gray and clipped close, his face carved by years of rule following rather than cruelty. He wore his uniform like armor, crisp and immaculate, as if wrinkles might invite chaos. To most of the staff, he was predictable, efficient, fair in the way systems like to call fair. He did not raise his voice. He did not bend rules for sentiment. He slept little and drank his coffee black, standing by the window of his office each morning, watching the snow settle into the prison yard like an unspoken verdict. Yet Claire Morgan's request followed him. A dog, she had said, a German shepherd. Hale tried to dismiss it as seasonal nonsense, a prisoner reaching for comfort during the holidays. He had approved and denied hundreds of such requests over the years. Calls to distant relatives, religious exemptions, last-minute appeals disguised as mercy. He knew how easily compassion could be exploited, how dangerous it was to mistake emotion for justice. Still, the words would not leave him. They lodged in his chest like a splinter, invisible but persistent. That evening, as the prison settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Hale remained in his office. Outside, snow fell steadily, the flakes thick and unhurried, coating the razor wire until it glistened like something almost beautiful. He opened Claire's file again, telling himself he was only reviewing protocol. The folder was heavy, swollen with reports, transcripts, exhibits. A life flattened into paper. He flipped through pages with professional detachment. Arrest records, trial summaries, disciplinary notes that were remarkably few. Claire Morgan, inmate behavior, compliant, reserved, no violent incidents. He paused at a photograph clipped loosely between documents. It slid free and fluttered onto his desk like an accusation. The image was old, taken years before incarceration. Claire stood in snow up to her boots, her hair longer then, pulled back loosely, her face open with a rare, unguarded smile. Beside her sat a young German shepherd puppy. Oversized paws splayed awkwardly on the ground, ears not yet sure which way they wanted to stand. The puppy leaned into her knee with blind trust. Behind them, visible through a window, was a small Christmas tree, cheap, artificial, decorated unevenly, its lights glowing with stubborn pride. Hale's breath caught because he had seen that dog before. Not that dog exactly, but one like him. Memory surged without invitation, dragging him backward through time. His younger brother, Michael Hale, had been a K9 handler, loud where Thomas was quiet, reckless where Thomas was careful. Michael believed dogs understood things humans never would. "They know who we are," he used to say, grinning as his German shepherd, a dark-coated male named Brutus, leaned against his leg. Years ago, during a routine roadside stop on a winter highway, things had gone wrong. A driver panicked, a shot rang out. Michael fell onto cold asphalt before Thomas could reach him. By the time Hale arrived, sirens screaming into the dark, his brother was already gone. Brutus had stood over the body, howling, a sound Hale still heard sometimes in dreams, raw and ancient, as if the earth itself were grieving. Hale stared at Claire's photograph until the prison walls seemed thinner, less certain. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. This was not about ghosts, he told himself. This was about procedure, but procedure, he knew, was shaped by people. He began carefully. He checked shelter records through official channels, his request framed as due diligence. The name Daniel Reed surfaced, a rural patrol officer with no disciplinary flags, a widower living outside town. Adoption paperwork confirmed the dog's identity. Axel, male, German shepherd, 5 years old at intake. Hale sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, considering. The risks were obvious: security concerns, emotional volatility, the optics of favoritism. The benefits were less tangible, harder to quantify. He called in Deputy Warden Elaine Porter, a woman in her early 50s with short-cropped hair and eyes that missed little. She had built her career on logistics and risk assessment, her demeanor brisk but not unkind. Hale laid out the request without commentary. "A dog visitation?" Porter said, eyebrows lifting slightly. "That's unconventional." "It's permitted under humanitarian review," Hale replied evenly, "with supervision." "And you believe this is wise?" "I believe it's allowable," he said, choosing his words with care. Porter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll need medical clearance, and security will have opinions." Security did. The chief, a stocky man named Raymond Knox with a shaved head and a reputation for caution, objected immediately. "Animals are unpredictable, emotional triggers, especially with lifers." Hale listened without interruption. When Knox finished, Hale said quietly, "So are humans, yet we manage them every day." Medical clearance came next. Dr. Nora Vance reviewed Claire's file with clinical precision. Vance was 52, tall and angular, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled into a severe bun. She did not waste words. "She's under stress," Vance said. "Chronic, elevated markers, but stable, for now." "For now," Hale echoed. Paperwork followed, forms, disclaimers, security protocols layered atop one another like armor. Hale drafted a request to the state. Oversight board, his language exact, stripped of sentiment. 1 supervised K9 visitation, 1 hour, full restraints, medical staff present, holiday humanitarian exception. He did not frame it as mercy. He framed it as compliance. When he finally leaned back in his chair, the office clock ticked loudly in the quiet. Outside, snow continued to fall, relentless and indifferent. Hale rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of stubble. He wondered, not for the first time, whether rules existed to protect people or to protect those who enforced them from having to feel too much. In cell C14, Claire sensed the change before she understood it. Routine shifted subtly. Guards lingered a moment longer. Glances exchanged over clipboards. When Hale appeared at her cell days later, his expression was unreadable. "Your request is under review," he said. "If approved, it will be supervised. Conditions will be strict." Claire nodded once, her heart hammering painfully in her chest. She did not smile. Hope, she had learned, was dangerous when handled carelessly. "Thank you," she said, voice steady. As Hale walked away, the echo of his footsteps seemed different, less final. He paused at the end of the corridor, just out of sight, and closed his eyes briefly. Michael's laugh flickered through his mind. Brutus's howl, the weight of years pressed down on him, heavy as snow on a roof. This was not kindness, Hale told himself again. It was precision. But somewhere deep beneath the concrete and wire, beneath the rules and routines, an old ghost stirred and opened a door just wide enough for something human to slip through. The visitation room at Ridgecrest State Prison had been designed to prevent miracles. Its white cinder block walls absorbed warmth and color alike, flattening everything into shades of compliance. Overhead, lights burned without mercy, too bright to be comforting, too dull to feel alive. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old metal, and every sound, boots on tile, keys at belts, the soft click of a door latch, echoed as if the room itself were listening. Outside, December tightened its grip on Whitehaven, snow sweeping across the yard in restless sheets, the sky low and pale, promising more cold before mercy. Inside, guards took their positions like chess pieces arranged for defense rather than play. There were 4 of them today, all uniformed, all alert, faces carefully neutral. A leash lay coiled neatly on the table, attached to a reinforced harness that had been checked and rechecked. Procedure had been obeyed with near religious devotion. When Claire Morgan entered the room, she did so in restraints. The chain linking her wrists clinked softly with each step, a small, humiliating sound that followed her like a reminder. She wore the standard gray prison uniform, loose at the shoulders, sleeves rolled back slightly to keep fabric from catching on cuffs. The years had refined her into sharper lines, cheekbones more pronounced, jaw set with quiet resolve. But her posture remained straight. She held herself the way she always had, as if dignity were something that could be practiced even under fluorescent lights. Her eyes scanned the room once, cataloging exits, faces, distances, an old habit she could not unlearn. Then she stopped, standing very still, breathing shallowly. Warden Thomas Hale watched from behind reinforced glass, hands clasped behind his back. Up close, his age showed more clearly. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a heaviness to his shoulders that no uniform could hide. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tight, muscles working as if he were holding something back. Dr. Nora Vance stood nearby, her posture alert, stethoscope already hanging around her neck. She observed Claire with clinical interest, noting pallor, the tension around her mouth, the way her fingers curled slightly despite the cuffs. Vance had learned long ago that bodies told truths before mouths ever did. The door on the opposite side of the room opened with a controlled hiss. Axel walked in. Not pulled, not coaxed. He stepped forward with measured confidence, his paws silent on the tile, his sable coat catching the harsh light in bands of dark and gold. He wore the harness easily, muscles shifting beneath it, his head high, ears pricked forward. He paused just inside the doorway, nose lifting as he tested the air. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then he saw her. For a fraction of a second, time hesitated. Axel's body stiffened, then surged forward, power contained but undeniable. The handler tightened the leash instinctively, boots bracing against the floor. "Easy," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire dropped to her knees without thinking, the chain clattering as her hands fell toward her chest. A sound tore out of her, half laugh, half sob, raw and unguarded. "Axel," she whispered, voice breaking. "Oh, baby. Oh, Axel." Axel pressed his forehead against her sternum, his body trembling, tail thumping the floor with desperate insistence, a heartbeat trying to restart the universe. He whined softly, the sound vibrating through her bones. Claire bent forward as far as the restraints allowed, resting her cheek against his neck, breathing him in. Fur, warmth, the faint scent of snow and hay, and something that felt like home. One guard cleared his throat and looked away. Another stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched, as if instructions might appear there. Even the handler loosened his grip slightly, caught in the gravity of the moment. Behind the glass, Hale felt something crack inside him. This was not protocol. This was not what forms could capture. He told himself he was observing, nothing more. Then Axel changed. His body went rigid. The thumping tail slowed, then stopped. His ears tilted back, not in fear, but in focus. He pulled his head from Claire's chest and began to sniff, methodical and intent. First her sternum, then the base of her neck, then along the left side of her chest. A low growl rose from deep in his throat, not aggression, but warning, the kind wolves give before an avalanche. Claire frowned through tears, confusion cutting through joy. "Axel?" she whispered. "What is it?" Axel pawed at her chest once, then again, harder, nails scraping fabric. His eyes were fixed on her face, urgent. Claire's breath hitched. The room tilted slightly, the light suddenly too bright. A sharp pain bloomed beneath her ribs, spreading like ice. She tried to speak, but the words tangled. Her shoulders trembled. Dr. Vance moved instantly. "Clear space," she ordered, voice slicing through the haze. Guards stepped back. The handler tightened the leash as Axel barked once, short, commanding, like a call to attention. Vance knelt, fingers already at Claire's wrist, then pressed her stethoscope to Claire's chest. Her expression shifted, sharpened by recognition. "Arrhythmia," she said. "Severe, possible ventricular event." A guard muttered, "Now?" "Yes," Vance snapped. "Now!" Claire sagged forward, the chain clinking as her hands fell. Her vision narrowed, sound rushing away like water down a drain. Axel strained against the leash, whining, his body vibrating with urgency. Nose pressed toward her chest as if he could will her heart back into rhythm. Warden Hale was moving before he realized it, stepping into the room, authority forgotten. "Hospital," he said, his voice no longer stone. "Immediately." The words cut through hesitation like a blade. Radios crackled, doors opened. A gurney appeared, wheels squealing softly. Vance worked quickly, efficient, precise, calling out instructions. Claire felt hands lifting her, cold air on her face, Axel's presence hovering close, his breath warm against her cheek. She tried to reach for him, fingers twitching uselessly against the cuffs. "Stay," she whispered, not knowing if the word reached him. Axel barked again, sharp and insistent, as if arguing with fate itself. As they wheeled her toward the door, snow howled outside, rattling the windows, winter pressing in hard against concrete and glass. Hale stood back, chest tight, watching the scene unfold. He thought of his brother, of Brutus's howl, of doors that closed too fast. For the first time in years, he did not look away. The visitation room emptied, lights humming on, indifferent. On the tile floor, Axel's paw prints faded as guards moved him back, his head turned, eyes locked on the retreating gurney. The room of bright shadows returned to silence, but something irreversible had already happened. Love had spoken, and the prison had listened. By the time the ambulance cleared the inner yard of Ridgecrest State Prison, night had fully claimed Whitehaven. Snow swarmed sideways under the floodlights, thick and relentless, turning the yard into a shifting sea of white. Wind clawed at coats and fences, rattling metal with restless impatience, as if winter itself objected to delay. The iron gate groaned open, its hinges protesting, and the ambulance pushed through, red lights slicing the darkness into urgent fragments. Inside, Claire Morgan lay strapped to the gurney, oxygen hissing softly beside her, her skin pale against the white sheets. Her eyes fluttered open and closed, consciousness slipping like a poorly held rope. Axel rode with her, secured beside the stretcher, his body rigid with focus, nose pressed as close to her hand as restraints allowed. Every bump in the road made his ears twitch. Every change in her breathing pulled his attention back to her face. He did not whine now. He watched, silent and unwavering, a guardian who had chosen vigilance over fear. Daniel Reed sat forward in the jump seat, hands braced against his knees, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He had followed the prison transport without thinking, boots still dusted with snow, jacket thrown on, half zipped. At 44, Daniel had faced violence, accidents, sudden death. But this was different. This was waiting. Waiting was the hardest kind of courage. He glanced at Axel, then at Claire, and swallowed. "You're not alone," he murmured, unsure who he was speaking to. Outside the prison walls, something unexpected began to form. Word moved through Whitehaven the way weather warnings did, quiet at first, then gathering force. A prisoner had collapsed. A dog had warned them. A German shepherd had saved a woman's life. Stories traveled faster than snowplows ever could. By the time the ambulance lights disappeared down the road, a small cluster of people had gathered near the outer gate. They were not angry. They were not loud. They came bundled in scarves and heavy coats, breath steaming in the cold. Thermoses passed from gloved hand to gloved hand. Some carried candles protected by jars. Others simply stood, hands tucked into pockets, faces turned toward the looming concrete shape of Ridgecrest. Someone hung a wreath on the chain-link fence, its green stark against the gray metal. Christmas carols rose hesitantly into the wind, voices shaky, imperfect, but sincere. Reverend Caleb Sloan stood near the front of the gathering. He was a man in his early 60s, tall and spare, with a shock of white hair and eyes that held both gentleness and fatigue. Years of pastoral work in a small town had taught him the limits of answers and the necessity of presence. He lifted his hands slightly, palms open, and prayed softly, not for miracles, but for truth, for mercy, for hearts capable of change. Nearby, an elderly woman with a cane held a piece of cardboard with trembling hands. On it, in uneven letters, had written, "Let justice breathe." Inside Ridgecrest, the oversight board convened in a sterile conference room that smelled faintly of old coffee and paper. The mood was sharp, brittle. Jackets were shrugged off impatiently. Voices overlapped. "She's a life inmate," one official snapped, a man with thinning hair and an expensive watch. "Medical emergency or not, this changes nothing." Dr. Nora Vance sat at the table, posture straight, eyes cold with resolve. "It changes everything," she replied. "If she dies in custody after exhibiting clear warning signs that were ignored, that is not justice. That is negligence." "We followed protocol," another voice argued. "We allowed the visit." "And that visit saved her life," Vance shot back. "That dog identified a severe cardiac event before our instruments did." The room fell momentarily silent. Warden Thomas Hale stood near the end of the table, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but something beneath it trembled. "We approved the visitation," he said. "We created the conditions for this moment. And that dog—" He paused, swallowing. "That dog performed more honest service tonight than most humans in this institution." Eyes turned toward him, surprised. Hale continued, quieter now. "We owe it to ourselves to look again. At everything." The argument resumed, but its edge had dulled. Outside, the vigil grew. Someone brought blankets. Someone else passed around cookies that tasted faintly of cinnamon and nostalgia. Snow gathered on shoulders and hats, melting slowly from body heat. No one left. At the hospital, fluorescent lights replaced prison glare. The ambulance doors burst open, and Claire was rushed down long corridors that smelled of antiseptic and overheated air. A cardiologist met them halfway, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and efficient hands. "Stress," he said quickly as they moved. "Cold exposure, possibly untreated arrhythmia." Axel was led to a waiting area, where Daniel finally knelt and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck. Axel leaned into him, accepting the contact, but never taking his eyes off the swinging doors that had swallowed Claire. Hours passed. Outside, Christmas Eve deepened. Snow softened, flakes drifting now instead of biting. Back at Ridgecrest, the oversight board reached a reluctant consensus. A temporary order was issued. Medical transfer authorized. Sentence review petition expedited. Independent audit of evidence granted. Not because the system had suddenly grown a conscience, but because the world was watching, and sometimes shame was the first step toward decency. Daniel dozed in a chair, his head tipped back, breath evening out at last. Axel remained awake, ears flicking at every sound, body angled toward the corridor. When the cardiologist finally emerged, his expression was grave, but not hopeless. "She made it to surgery in time," he said. "Another hour and—" He shook his head. "She's stable, for now." Daniel let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for years. Axel rose, tail wagging once, restrained but hopeful. Outside, church bells rang midnight. Their sound carried on softened air. Christmas had arrived quietly, without fanfare. Snow settled gently on Whitehaven, on prison walls and hospital roofs alike, as if the world itself had decided to pause. At the iron gate of Ridgecrest, candles burned low, their flames steady against the cold, and somewhere between law and mercy, between iron and breath, a story began to turn. Morning arrived at Whitehaven Memorial Hospital, the way forgiveness often does, quietly, without ceremony, almost embarrassed by its own power. Snow drifted down in soft, disciplined flakes, no longer driven by anger or wind, but falling as if it had finally decided to rest. The world outside the hospital windows looked scrubbed clean, edges softened, colors muted into whites and pale blues. It was the kind of morning that felt like a pause in a long argument. Claire Morgan woke to the sound of machines breathing for her. At first, she thought she was still dreaming. The ceiling above her was too bright, too smooth, lacking the hairline cracks she had memorized in her prison cell. The air smelled wrong, sharp and sterile, layered with antiseptic instead of bleach and rust. Her chest ached, a deep, spreading soreness that pulsed in time with a steady electronic beep. When she tried to move, pain answered immediately, firm and undeniable. She was alive. Dr. Elaine Foster stood at the foot of the bed when Claire finally focused her eyes. Foster was in her late 40s, tall and lean, with dark skin and closely cropped hair already streaked with gray. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had made peace with both success and failure. Her voice was even, warm without being sentimental. "You scared us," she said gently. "Another hour without intervention, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Claire swallowed, throat dry. "The dog," she whispered. "Axel." Dr. Foster nodded. "He's the reason you're still here. Severe arrhythmia, stress, prolonged cold exposure, untreated episodes stacking over time. Your body was keeping score even when the system wasn't." She paused, then added, "We don't usually credit patients' lives to intuition, but in this case, we'd be foolish not to." Down the hall, in a chair that had molded itself to his body overnight, Daniel Reed slept with his jacket still on, boots unlaced but not removed, one arm hanging loosely at his side. Axel lay pressed against his leg, head resting on Daniel's foot like an anchor. His amber eyes were open, tracking movement, alert but no longer frantic. When a nurse passed, Axel lifted his head slightly, then settled again, waiting, but with purpose now. When Daniel woke and learned Claire had survived surgery, the sound he made was small and involuntary, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He scrubbed a hand over his face and looked down at Axel. "You did it," he murmured. Axel's tail thumped once against the floor, controlled, restrained, as if he understood this was not the moment for celebration, only confirmation. While Claire slept, something else stirred across town. At a small rented office above a closed insurance agency, an independent forensic accountant named Matthew Ives worked through digital records that had been buried for years. Ives was 39, narrow-framed, bespectacled, with the nervous energy of someone who trusted numbers more than people. He had been brought in reluctantly by the State Oversight Board, more to quiet public pressure than from any real expectation of discovery. He expected messy accounting. He did not expect impossibilities. Log-in activity attributed to Claire Morgan during hours when she was already in custody. Transaction timestamps overlapping with verified prison intake logs. A signature encryption key duplicated from an outdated database. Something no competent investigator would have missed if they'd truly been looking. Ives leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This wasn't sloppy work. It was constructed. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Funds had moved cleanly, confidently, guided by someone who understood the system well enough to manipulate it without drawing attention. All roads led back to one man with access, motive, and a talent for hiding behind authority: Grant Hollis. When federal investigators confronted Hollis days later, the man who had once smiled like polished currency looked suddenly small. His silver hair was disheveled, his hands trembling as he reached for water. His confession was not dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no righteous justifications, only excuses, pressure, fear, the belief that he deserved more for keeping things running. The banality of it made it worse. Evil, it turned out, had not worn horns. It had worn tailored suits and smiled at donors. In a courtroom packed with quiet breath and held emotion, Claire's conviction was overturned. No cheers erupted, no one clapped. The silence was so complete it felt sacred. The judge's voice echoed briefly, then receded into history. Claire sat at the defense table, hands folded, posture rigid, listening as years of her life were returned to her in legal language that could never give them back. Tears slid down her face without sound. She did not wipe them away. Daniel stood in the aisle, Axel seated beside him in a simple service harness, calm and dignified. Axel's ears were forward, his body still, like a guardian carved from older stories, one of those loyal beasts who guide the innocent back from the underworld and then ask for nothing in return. When Claire stepped outside, the cold air shocked her lungs. Snow fell gently, no longer violent, settling on her hair, her shoulders, the ground beneath her feet. She closed her eyes and let it land. Sunlight filtered through cloud cover, pale but real. She was shaking, not from cold, but from the overwhelming fact of freedom. Axel reached her first. He pressed his head against her leg, solid and warm, a weight she had dreamed of in concrete nights. She knelt carefully, ignoring the ache in her chest, and wrapped her arms around him. He leaned into her with his full strength, grounding her to the moment, to the world. Healing was not instant. Claire still startled at metal doors, still woke some nights with the echo of fluorescent hums in her ears. But every morning, Axel reminded her where she was by pressing his forehead against her knee until she smiled. That became their ritual. They moved west to Port Townsend, Washington, where winter smelled of salt and cedar instead of iron and bleach. There, Claire trained K-9 search and rescue teams, working alongside Daniel on his days off. The work was quiet, purposeful. It felt like atonement without shame. On Christmas, Claire hung a single ornament on a modest tree, a small wooden paw. She laughed when she noticed the old plastic reindeer from Daniel's yard, leaning sideways in the corner, transported faithfully across state lines, absurd and defiant. Sometimes fate whispers before it strikes, and sometimes love barks louder. At the end of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes they come quietly through loyalty, truth and love that refuses to forget. When the world judged too quickly, God waited patiently and placed his answer in the heart of a faithful dog. In our daily lives, we may feel trapped by mistakes, injustice, or silence, but this story teaches us that God sees what others overlook, and his timing is never wrong. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson you felt most deeply. Please support our channel by subscribing, so more stories of faith, love, and redemption can reach others. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and truth. If you believe in God's miracles, please comment, Amen, and walk with us again in the next story.